Hello, Hill City, and all those who are joining us online. Today we are going through our discussion from the message series, Letters to the Church. And today's church that was written about was Pergamum. And we're going to open this up with just kind of a summary over the message, as well as just in insightful ideas of the historical context and how everything fit together. Go ahead, Hannah.
Yeah, so the church at Pergamum, we kind of envisioned it this way, that they are caught between two invitations, two banquets.
Good.
So on one hand, they have the invitation, like the rest of the culture around them, to worship Caesar, to worship other gods, to give into idolatry, and the sexual immorality that was often associated with idolatry. And all of that actually happened at real feasts, because in their day and time, parties were everything. They had parties that were thrown by family members. They had parties that were thrown by their patrons or their supporters who had either given them jobs or commerce or something that then bound them to the patron to honor them. And there were feasts that were thrown by guilds. So if you were a craftsperson, you might be invited to the guild of the metalsmiths or whatever else. And at these banquets, there wasn't just eating and drinking, though that happened in excess. There was also honoring Caesar, worship of Caesar, and there was worship of other patron god and goddesses. And there was also entertainment that was expected, and often this entertainment took the form of prostitutes. And so these banquets were a real part of everyday life for many Christians in the Roman Empire, but it seems to be being addressed here specifically at Pergamum. And that's because there is some teacher or teachers who are being labeled as a Balaam. And so we kind of dived into the Old Testament to say Balaam was an Old Testament figure. He was a foreign prophet who was brought in by the king of Moab to curse Israel. And he couldn't curse them at all, which was a funny story in it of itself. But at the end of the day, after he couldn't curse them, he gave the king of Moab advice that he should try to ensnare the nation of Israel by really attacking the basis of their covenant with God, which was not to worship any other gods. And so the Moabites invite them to a feast. A bunch of them do take part in idolatry. And so throughout the history following, Balaam's known as this figure who entices the people of God to worship other gods, to turn their back on their special relationship with Yahweh. And so that's no different in the New Testament. And so it wasn't a teacher named Balaam at Pergamum. It was probably just somebody who, like Balaam, was tempting Christians in that church to be a part of idolatry in their culture. And like we said, a big place that happened was at banquets. And then we just talked about Christian history. How many times have many in the church, not all, but how many times have many been tempted to compromise with a culture around them at key moments in history, but also just in everyday life. And instead, Jesus offers a promise at the end of this section saying, you know what, if you stay faithful, if you endure, if you keep your eyes on me, you're invited to the banquet of the marriage supper of the Lamb. You are invited to my feast, where you are known and loved and seen in a way that none of these other things can provide. And so that's kind of the summary of that sermon and that message on the letter to the church at Pergamum.
Yeah, what always kind of is interesting to me is the idea of feasts and parties and banquets, because we kind of get it because of marriages. There's a big feast, or like a 70th birthday or anniversaries. We always go out and we associate with food. But how important being a part of a party was.
Yes.
Right? You're invited to this party or you're not invited. And when you were invited to a party, that meant that you also were invited into their privileges, their access, their power, and you were accepted into the culture.
Right.
And then if you weren't invited, then you were not accepted, you were pushed out, you were marginalized. And so just imagine, and I can imagine this like even with businesses, right? Imagine if you're a part of this conglomerate group of businesses, then you're doing business together. You know that you're financially sound. But if you're outside, then you're much more afraid. So it still happens in a way today, but not like it was back then, because it was that whole accepted, rejected. And then like a big part for me is just like understanding what you said at the end, like that Jesus talks about feasts all over the place, right? I think about the lost son, the lost coin, and how at the end they throw this banquet party, and in the prodigal son, how the father is begging the older son to come in and banquet with him because it's that important. And then how that correlates to to the final banquet, right? We have that the last supper, what we call it, of Jesus going to the cross, and then we have that other supper, which represents us around the table with God in heaven. And just the amount of correlation to think about, that we as people, no matter who you are, because of Jesus, we're invited to the table of God. I think that's really, really important to breathe that in. That you did not earn it. It wasn't because of your family name. It wasn't because of your power or your wealth, but you're invited into the table of God because of Jesus, his righteousness and his sacrifice. And for us to just stop for a moment, anytime we take communion, it's really emotional for me, because I can't believe that I get to be a part of the table of God in that moment, and then also representing forever, Yeah. Those are just banqueting is just always
Yeah, it's a huge theme. I mean, we kind of said, or I think I said in the recorded version, definitely ask Isaac Oliveras, because he wrote a whole thesis on feasting in the New Testament and all this symbolism of that, all the meanings that has. But yeah, I think we had said at the end, the stone that's granted is probably representing, that access point where in ancient feasts they'd sort of collect a stone from the guests to show that they were able to come into the banquet, and whether that's what that particular part represents or not, that we are all invited personally to take part in that feast.
Yeah.
But so often, the cares of this world, the pressures of different systems or our own desires pulls us away from that. And that's sort of the practical or applicational point we ended on, is just asking people to think about what are those desires you have that you're persuaded God cannot fill, and the systems you're persuaded he cannot change. The desires you're persuaded he cannot fill, and the systems you're persuaded he cannot change, because you think that's just how things are and God doesn't have a hand.
Yeah.
If you remain faithful, what are all the things you're going to miss out on? And I think when we frame idolatry that way and not just bowing to a gold statue, it's much easier to understand both the temptation of the Christians then and where we may not realize we're conforming
to
now.
The system, right? The system of the world, the ways of the world. And so and I really wanted to talk through the idea of systems. Maybe we call it systems, and you're like, that doesn't even make sense, right? But it's what is the system that we live by to give us identity, worth, you can call it power, wealth, whatever, the end means, right? We live in such a way, in such a process, you can call it systems, process, worldview, story, narrative, framework, plausibility, structure, all the same thing, right? It's just words that says that we live out a story. We live out a storied system that we believe that we should become.
Yeah.
Right? And Jesus has a system for us to live by.
Yeah.
And then idolatry is to believe that Jesus' system will not work in our life, right?
Yeah.
And so we have to take control of our own life, be our own God, and we'll take advice from Jesus as a good sage, right? An insightful person, but we will not take his advice in actually creating the system we live by.
Yeah.
And that comes out to like giving our soul to our work. And I'm not taking away from work. Work is so important. It is the fruit of our labor. God loves work. He created work, right? Even before the fall. And so it's not work, but it's like, what is the system or the way or the story that we tell to give us our identity?
And what are those things you're hoping to gain at the end?
Yeah.
Because if it's anything other than really Jesus at the end saying, well done, good and faithful servant, if instead it's power, money, control, whatever, a certain type of life,
self-image,
yeah. So many things it could be. But what are those things you're hoping to gain by working 80 hours a week, or by looking a certain way, or by having X amount of dollars in your bank account? Not that any of those things, money or power, always are evil.
No,
but
those
when
are gifts of God.
they become our goal, our desires are completely out of whack.
Yeah, if they become the label of our identity, and that's what we're seeking after, that's the system that we've created in our life, then it is idolatry. Mm-hmm. And so like the big question for me is like, and I'm talking to myself mostly, is like, is the system that I've created for life idolatry towards God? Mm-hmm. Is the way that I created my life and what's important and what has highest priority, what has my greatest love, is that actually idolatry, or like a worship of the thing, worship of the self, worship of myself, or like of money, or who I want to become, or sex, or relationship, or religiosity? It's really can get really tricky. Or is it for me to become in the likeness, in the way of Jesus? I'm believing that Jesus is the highest way, the greatest way of being human. Is that what my system is about, or is it idolatry? And this is strong, and I mean that. This is not lightweight stuff. This is something we really need to drink in and think about. And maybe you're hearing this and you're like, oh, it's whatever, but it's not whatever, because we live out what we actually believe. And what I mean by that is we know a lot of good Jesus things, but the way we live, what we actually live out, is what we believe is real, and the other stuff is just information. So we can talk about loving Jesus, loving our neighbors, believing that Jesus is the goal of our lives, and we want to live our lives like him. That's great for us to know. But if we don't actually even strive or have any system set in place to live that way, we don't actually believe it. And there's a gap between what we know and what we believe or live out. Our actions dictate what we actually believe deep within ourselves. And so how does that hit you? How, is there something greater than Jesus on the order of loves for our life? Any other thoughts for that?
I think where we really find in our own lives this sort of tension is during times of suffering, and we've talked a lot about suffering in this series because the early church suffered in a lot of different ways. And it seems that this particular church, someone named Antipas had actually been killed for his faith. So obviously suffering in ways often in our own setting we can't imagine, but there is legitimate suffering in our lives. And I think where we find our idolatries are often in those places of suffering, because our lack of belief in Jesus' power to make us into his likeness, which is supposed to be the goal of our lives, is severely undermined when we're in a place of suffering, because we find out suddenly what we really believe.
Yeah.
Which is often that the goal of life is to not suffer, The goal of life is to avoid hardships. It's to have good relationships that never have times of trial. It's to, have that perfect life you've envisioned yourself without heartache or health issues or whatever else. And if God isn't seeming to protect you in that, what does that faith in Jesus actually mean? And I think that's where we come back to, what are those desires that we've placed above are becoming more like Jesus? And I guess I say that slowly and with hesitation because I don't want you to hear what I'm not saying, that God can't change things or that he doesn't heal or that he doesn't restore in amazing, miraculous ways, because he does. But also, if he uses all things and he doesn't waste anything, then those times of suffering are an opportunity for us to say, I don't know why this sucks so much. I don't know why things are so difficult here, but my eyes are on you, Jesus. And I want to sit at that banquet with you. I want to be in your presence. And sometimes that requires coming face to face with the idols we've made of what our lives would look like.
Man, that could be a long conversation too.
Yes.
Yeah. I was just, as you're talking about suffering, all these is following Jesus the avoidance of suffering? Are we making like this wrong equation about God, or is following Jesus about Jesus? And that's the biggest thing, is following Jesus about us and taking away all, if I follow Jesus, all these good things will happen, and which is true, but it doesn't take away suffering and our free will, right?
Yeah.
Or is following Jesus about us? And even in that thought you're presenting, it's like there could be idolatry behind it. Yeah. So just a lot of thoughts.
And when we give into idolatry, which we talked about briefly before when I was giving the summary of this sermon, when we give into idolatry, it also destroys our witness to the outside world. And that's where you see throughout history times when the church has conformed in racism, in systems of power that trampled people, in all sorts of ways that actually provided a very poor witness to the world of what Christ looks like. And so we may feel like those, especially the small idolatries, won't have any effect, like they're not going to do anything long term, but they create in us that the likelihood that we will conform to the pattern of this world in ways that don't really witness of God's power.
Like the acceptance of idolatry. And then, that's hard. I would say in our culture right now, we're walking that line, and sometimes it is very, very difficult. But I would say once again is like, what is your story wanting to tell? What is the system that we've created and is going to turn out? Yeah. So thank you so much for just joining us on this conversation, and I hope that you took some notes and just to dive into those thoughts for yourself. Don't just hear it. What does that mean for me, and how can I partake in what it means to apprentice under Jesus? God bless you.